So welcome back. We're looking at system architecture. What's the name of the person who designed this model of system architecture?
John von Neumann.
Neumann.
John von Neumann is correct. And I'm going to show you a blank one tomorrow, and I want you to be able to fill it in. So it's important to study this, not just to know what goes in the different empty places, but if there's a double arrow here and single arrows there, it's important to get every aspect of this correct, because that has a very strong bearing on the rest of our material for the final module. So Schneider is, there he is. Good afternoon, Schneider. How are you? Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things that we need to understand about this particular aspect of computer science, this particular discipline, computer architecture as a discipline, is that it has a very short professional half-life. What do I mean by half-life? So let's share this. This just in. How many of you remember we, in the last module, talked about 3D transistors? Yes?
Yes.
Yeah.
3D transistors, I think, were announced and promoted around 2010. That was 10 years ago. And in order for Moore's law to continue, every 18 months to 2 years, you have to double the number of transistors in a chip. And they, even with 3D transistors, they were running out of capacity. But here we go, right? Here's the next invention, the next innovation. It is a quantum mechanical transistor. It may increase computer speed and sensor accuracy. More importantly, when you're talking about a quantum level transistor, that is extremely small. That's like atomic level. So it's down to it shrinks down even further. They were talking about nanometers on the video. This is even smaller. And that allows you to build a chip that is capable of 1 trillion floating point operations per second. So extremely, extremely fast, right? And here they mention gallium arsenide again, right? So you're going to see some of these things repeating over and over again. But if 3D transistors don't allow Moore's law to continue, this new invention will allow it to continue for many more years. And what's happening is that the professional half-life of people in this field, all right, so if let me get back to my screen here. In simple terms, the professional half-life means that it's the time that passes for you to become half incompetent, for you to lose half of your knowledge. So let me give you a quick example. The professional half-life of a medical doctor is just 5 years. True or false? It takes about 10 years to become a medical doctor. 10 years of, well, 4 years of undergraduate school, and then you go to med school, and then you have a residency and an internship. It takes 10 years to become a doctor, yes? Everybody with me?
Yep.
Yes. Now, in medical disciplines in healthcare, the rapid advances in medicine are happening so fast that in 5 years, after a doctor is newly graduated and starts practice, in just 5 years, they will become incompetent if they don't keep up with new advances, if they don't conduct continuing professional development. Okay? So guess what the professional half-life is for computer architecture? It tracks with Moore's law. That's a good guess. It runs about the same, right? So in one of our resources here, and I'm still working on the supplementals, special topics. So you're going to have 3 references for this module. The first one is going to be the study guide, like you always have with student learning objectives. And then you're going to have 2 other ones. One special topic has to do with the Internet of Things, and the other special topic has to do with the I/O continuum. So I/O has to do with input-output. What we're talking about is this piece right here. So once again, the Internet of Things is taking this and miniaturizing it to the point where you can stuff a full-blown computer in the size of a credit card. Did we talk about the Raspberry Pi yet? So this is a picture of a Raspberry Pi. And this Raspberry Pi, see the little raspberry right there? So about 10 years ago, Cambridge University said it's not good for computing the computing revolution to leave half of our population of the planet behind. We have to put computers in the hands of people who don't have money for computers. So they came up with this. It's the size of a credit card. If you take a credit card out of your wallet right now and you hold it up next to this Raspberry Pi, it is just that large. That's your processor, that's the memory, and then these are the input outputs. Remember, I told you, if you can identify where the memory is and the processor, what's everything else? Input output, right? So you have to be able to identify the components based on a picture, based on a diagram. And one of the things that I wanted to share with you is this idea of professional half-life. So because of Moore's law, the professional half-life in computer architecture is about 2 years. You can spend 4 years getting a degree in computer architecture, specifically at certain universities. And if you do nothing to keep up to date, then you miss out on things like, oh, they're doing quantum transistors now. Well, when did they do that? Oh, I don't know. They started that like 18 months ago, right? They started that 18 months ago. And if you look in the upper corner here, this is a news release of what they were working on back in 1998. The idea of quantum transistors has been around, but how easy it is to, how soon it is before we'll have quantum computers, right? So these are quantum transistors, and are they commercially available? Are they something that we can make yet? Well, this was announced in 1998, and they're in the process of making quantum transistors practical in terms of manufacturing. We don't have a quantum computer yet. But this innovation and this development is helping keep Moore's law active, which means we don't have a heck of a lot of time to enjoy our knowledge. If it takes you 4 years to learn computer architecture and you don't keep up with advances daily, in 2 years flat, the knowledge that you have is largely obsolete. That is the professional half-life, okay? And And why is that happening? This explosion we call the Internet of Things. So 10 years ago, Cambridge said everybody needs to be able to enjoy computers. They started this initiative. Now there are millions of Raspberry Pis everywhere. Did I tell you what this costs? Would anyone care to guess what this credit card size?
Isn't it like $20?
Yeah. Yeah, the older versions you can pick up for 20 bucks on eBay. The brand new one, the latest model, the Pi 4B is $35. If you get it with extra RAM, 4 gigabytes, it'll run Windows. It'll run Windows, and it costs a little extra for the 4 gigs. I think it's 50 bucks. And that's a brand new system, right? So how do you cope? How do you deal with the advances? And how do you keep abreast? How do you keep pace with what's going on? You learn the classic essentials, right? Everything that's digital that computes has to have memory, it has to have a CPU, and what's everything else? Input, output, right? Those three basic things. And there are some elegant and new things, but in the study guide that you're about to receive, every link that you see, you really need to click on it, right? So here's says practice for this. How do you practice identifying what the components are on a diagram? We'll start with this link. So when I clicked, come on. So we showed you this yesterday, yeah, for a bit. Anatomy of a motherboard. So anatomy is a fancy word that means the parts of a motherboard, the parts of a power supply, the parts of a hard disk drive, parts of a graphics card, right? The parts of a CPU. This is a great site. Specifically, what I want you to do is I want you to practice looking at motherboards, and I want you to be able to pick out the two main components that differentiate from every other component, namely the CPU. It's a squarish, the largest square in the middle is usually the CPU. And if you have any doubts, just Google the model number. Like this is a socket type, LGA, which stands for like low something. LGA has to do with the insertion of the chip in the mount for the socket, right? And that's a little spring-loaded arm. But basically, you'll find all of the memory modules tightly packed together next to each other. There's usually 2, 4, 6, or 8. In servers, there's 8, there's 12, there's 16, you know. So you identify the CPU, you identify the memory modules, and then what's everything else? Come on.
Input, output.
Input, output. Which includes this bad boy right here. This Intel chip is actually, it's a chipset that helps run the data bus and bridge. So what do I mean by that? This is a very simple diagram, but when you have a 64-bit CPU, you have 64 lines, not just one. Let me repeat that. When you have a 64-bit CPU, you have 64 of these lines. So the diagram looks a lot scarier and hairier. You have 64 lines going in and out here and in and out here, or maybe 32, right? So there's a lot of lines. When you have so many data connections, those are commonly referred to as a data bus. And when all the buses pile together, there's a common infrastructure that was set up that has to do with North Bridge and South Bridge. We'll get to that in a second. So we'll expand on that idea in just a moment. But one of the coping mechanisms is to understand the foundation, the essentials, right? So no matter what no matter how complicated you're looking at it, there's a CPU, there's memory, and there's input-output. And that memory has to be able to handle data, digital information. It has to be able to sequence or stagger or structure statements, programming statements and instructions, what you're going to do to perform calculations and compute against the data, right? You're going to do that with the ALU. Your register is going to be the short-term memory next to that ALU, and the controller helps. It's like the traffic light of that process. So you're going to be telling certain instructions, green, red, yellow, green, red, yellow, like traffic lights, and it's the controller's job to do this. So one of the ways you can describe the controller's function is like a traffic light controller for a whole city. Does everybody understand? Have you ever seen movies where they hack the traffic lights and all the traffic lights turn red and all the traffic jams to a halt?
Live Free, Die Hard.
Yeah, that one. That's a good one. That's a great example. So a controller, a good analogy is to think of the traffic controls for an entire set of traffic lights for an entire city. That's what a controller does on a macroscopic level. What's another basic thing that you can grasp that's really easy to understand, and it's essential information, and it's true for every digital system that computes, no matter how small or how big? And that would be what happens when you power it on. Okay, so the first thing you want to learn is the von Neumann model. The second thing you want to learn is how to identify the von Neumann parts when you're looking at diagrams and schematics and pictures. And the third thing you want to learn is, okay, what happens when I power this on? Right? When you power on any digital device, it boots. What it's doing when it boots is that it's loading the operating system. So your operating system is what translates the hardware into software resources the programming statements can operate against. So if you're going to show something on the display, this little gizmo here is an HDMI output. So that's the power input. That's a USB-C, and these are two dual monitor 4K HDMI outputs. What am I saying? A $35 computer can drive two 4K TVs. Wow. I mean, let me repeat that. In case you're wondering what you should do for Christmas for people who don't have enough tech in their house. This is 35 bucks. It plugs into a 4K TV, and you can watch 4K videos, music videos. I mean, if your internet will do that. You can also plug in a USB thumb drive with 4K downloads or 4K movies, and this will play those things, right? So that's how cool it is. But never mind that. What's common about this and a $100,000 server in an Amazon data center? When you power them on, the first thing they do is they run a self-test. This is called the power on self-test, or POST, power on self-test. And what happens is that it starts sending electrons and signals to each of the components. So when you power it on, it's going to work a check with the CPU, it's going to work a check with the RAM, then it's going to connect to the disk drive, which is actually an SD card down here. So the input-output hard disk is an SD card underneath, doesn't show on this side, right? So that power on self-test is going to conduct a basic inventory and check for function with the system hardware resources, okay? The first thing it's going to do, and I want you to remember this, don't let me trick you. On the next assessment, please don't let me trick you. What's the first thing that happens after the power on self-test? It's going to read data from the hard disk sectors. It's going to read from this, from the hard disk, because there's persistent memory non-volatile memory, it's still there even after the power is turned off. When you turn it on, it's going to have to read some of those software and boot all the operating system, boot up commands and stuff like that. They all have to be read out of that hard disk. So after it checks the status and function of each of the components, it's going to draw from that hard disk and it's going to read from that. Okay, that's the second thing that happens. And the initial data and instructions are loaded where? Where have you seen the words data and instructions? RAM.
Yeah, RAM.
Yeah. Can you go right from the hard disk into the CPU? No.
No.
Now, there is a special case, and we get into that in the operating systems course, and I don't want you to worry about that right now. Okay? The thing I want you to understand is that the RAM has 64 channels. The RAM is huge. It's 64 channels, and all that data flies across the data bus from the CPU and then into the registers of the CPU. So the CPU says, okay, let's have it. Tells the hard disk, read the data, loads it into RAM, and then from the RAM, it goes into the registers of the CPU, and then the CPU can start operating, right? So the CPU directs traffic. It says, hey, hard disk, you have to load the data out of there into the data and instructions into RAM, and then the CPU can act on it. So technically speaking, I guess the first thing that actually happens is that the CPU says, okay, hard disk, you're up to bat, right? CPU doesn't do anything until power on self-test. But what's the first real action? We read everything off the hard disk. Where does it go? Into the RAM. And where from there? Into the CPU. If I want to ask you generically, what's the flow of information when you power something on? Everyone remember, first from the hard disk, into the RAM, onto the CPU. Okay? Please, don't let me trick you. I'll try to be tricky. Now, data and instructions are moving back and forth between the CPU. That happens a lot. It's very high performance. It happens very quickly, and RAM is very close to the CPU. That is why on motherboards, on system architecture, you always, how often? Always see RAM next to what? The CPU. Does everybody understand that? So if I point to something and I say, what's the nearest major component next to this? And I'm pointing next to memory, what's your answer?
CPU.
CPU, exactly. And if I point to the CPU, I say, what's the major component next to this?
RAM.
Exactly. It's like they're two peas in a pod. If you don't have the RAM right next to the CPU, and there's a reason for that, right? So this data bus, it's wide and it's super fast. And oh, there is one more thing I want to talk to you about. This power on self-test, the actual hardware that performs, the actual resources that perform the power on self-test is something called the BIOS. It's the basic input-output system. So the power on self-test is performed when the BIOS initiates. So you power on the system, and the BIOS says, okay, it's time to do the power on self-test. So is it the CPU that does the power on self-test? No. The BIOS does the self-test. The self-test checks the CPU. Is the CPU directing traffic yet? No. When you power on the system, the BIOS kicks into gear. It says, okay, run the power on self-test. It checks all the components out. It checks them for status and function. And then the CPU says, okay, first at bat, who's first up? Hard disk. Who's next? RAM. Who's third? CPU. It's like a baseball game, right? Now, the thing I want you to understand about BIOS is that the BIOS chipset is made out of NORs instead of NANds. Does everybody remember this? We had this in previous module. Please say yes. Solid state hard drives are made out of NANDs.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
BIOS chipsets are made out of NORs. This is a favorite target of hackers. I want to tell you about this. Two things that are important to remember about this. BIOS. It's a favorite target of hackers. That's the first thing I want you to know. Why? What is it that actually operates first? The CPU or the hard disk or what? It's the BIOS, right? So let's look at a BIOS chip real quick. I want you to see this. And I'm a fan of ASUS as a brand, but I also like Intel motherboards. I like, oh my gosh, there are so many favorite motherboards, but I love, so BIOS chipset. So BIOS chips are smaller chips that are sitting on the motherboard directly, and it takes this little battery cell. It's a watch cell battery. It's a watch cell battery that sits on the motherboard, and that keeps the BIOS fresh and active. And this is not the best. All right, so here's a BIOS chip. So everybody see this little square here? Not very big, is it? It's a little square chip, and it's made of what? NANDs or NORs?
NORs.
NORs. It's made of NORs, yes. And what keeps it alive? Well, technically speaking, this keeps the battery, the time clock, and the date on your motherboard correct, which is needed for this to work properly. But anyway, this is what starts up the system and conducts the power on self-test. And there's memory in here. There's non-volatile memory, and this helps maintain the date and time on the system so that this works properly, because if the date and time on the system is wrong and then it starts connecting to everything and it's suddenly 1999, the computer doesn't work right. Does that make sense? Yeah, kind of, sort of. Why would hackers want to infect this little thing right here? Well, in simple terms, if they infect this, it's really hard to get rid of. If they infect the hard disk, you can wipe the hard disk free of viruses, can't you? I mean, haven't you heard about that? People have antivirus. They remove the virus from the hard drive. Or they discover the virus in RAM and they kill it in RAM, yeah? But what happens if it's sitting in BIOS? Before the CPU can run the antivirus to kill the antivirus. Let's say that again. What if the virus is in the BIOS and it's there and active before the CPU can even come up and run the antivirus to kill it?
Computer won't operate.
It's very hard for the computer to operate securely and safely, yes, because it's hard to get rid of. Here's the second thing I want you to know about this BIOS. It's tied to the watch cell battery that maintains the date and time. And if you lose your date and time and the battery goes bad, a lot of systems won't come up right. So if you have an older system and then you turn it on and then you get this funny looking screen and you're like, oh, I lost the hard drive. It could be that the watch cell battery went bad. And all you got to do is open it up and replace the little button cell. And then it starts right up again. Happens all the time. You bring it into Best Buy, or you bring it into the Geek Squad, or you bring it into a computer repair shop. And what do? They pull the little button cell out and they check it with a voltmeter and they go, oh, yeah, okay. And then all of a sudden, oh, I got all my stuff back. And that's $100. Thank you very much. And that's something you can do. You can find this on laptop motherboards and PC motherboards and game station, PlayStation, Xbox. A lot of computers have this, right? Now, the Raspberry Pi does not have a button watch cell battery. It does without that, and it uses some other memory cell to maintain the date and time for a little while, but it has another set of logic to update the date and time once you power it on. So they've kind of worked around that. But that's a common thing I want you to remember about the BIOS, is that battery, the little silver button on the motherboard, it goes bad. Any questions about the BIOS and how exposed it is and how hackers love it? So they have this new kind of BIOS. It's called UEFI. It's designed to replace the BIOS. Basically, your motherboard can start up and run the power on self-test, and it does not even use the BIOS chip. Instead, it reads a hidden file from a disk, and it's supposed to be more secured, and hackers have figured out how to infect that. So this is a new style of BIOS. I want you to know UEFI is a new style of BIOS designed to improve system security. However, hackers are getting very good at cracking that open too. And once that's infected, you're just as bad off as if they infected the BIOS. Any questions about BIOS, power on self-test, and the sequence of activity when any system starts up? So the first action, once your power on self-test is done, data out of the persistent memory, the SD card, the hard disk, something like that. Where does it go? Into the RAM. Where from there? Into the CPU, and away you go. Okay. All right. So there's going to be lots of references, and a lot of the references, so when we talk about BIOS, EEPROM and double EEPROM is erasable programmable only memory. That's the kind of memory that's NOR. It's made with NOR. That's what's used in the BIOS. So if I ask you questions about EEPROM or double EEPROM, I'm talking about the erasable programmable read-only memory that's in the BIOS. It is erasable if it's some of it's electrically erasable, or UV light. UV light, but black light can erase an EEPROM BIOS chip. So some BIOS chips are made out of erasable programmable only memory. You can flash the memory, so they talk about flashing it with new BIOS. In fact, a lot of times when your system doesn't work right and it's 2 or 3 years old and you've run all of the operating system updates, if you haven't flashed a new version of the BIOS, that usually solves the problem. That's another thing that techs do with system architecture all the time, where they make hundreds of dollars and all they're doing is flashing a new BIOS image onto the chip. So the BIOS chip has this read-only memory that's fairly persistent, and it's made with NORs, and you can flash it. You can write over it with new versions of the BIOS, and that can replace old BIOS that's vulnerable to viruses. That can fix problems that a 2 or 3 year old system has that nothing else will fix. And I just wanted you to be aware of that aspect of the BIOS as well. You flash the BIOS, I mentioned that right here. Another trick of the computer repair, here's a YouTube video. This is supposed to be linked. I wonder if this is still good. Let me check this. Are there any questions about BIOS, power on self-test?
Grammarly can help you write quickly
No question.
and confidently, so you never have to slow down at work.
Welcome to PC Words Kids Weekly Answer Back episode number 27. Today we're doing a special answer back relating to BIOS updates. Many of you have asked me how to update your BIOS. You've got all kinds of different motherboards. I'm going to go through some examples. Always go to the motherboard website, check and see the version of your motherboard, what BIOS updates they have, what it can do for your machine. Usually if you have to upgrade to a new CPU, you want a BIOS update, so then you go ahead and download it. Download all the information, the README text, any files, all of those files you'll have to use.
Did you just hear that? If you want to upgrade your CPU, hello? Did everybody hear that?
Yeah.
So what are we saying? I have an ASUS motherboard. I did this. There's my AS, it's spelled ASUS, ASUS, Chinese brand, made in Taiwan. What's the big square thing in the middle? CPU, right? What are the ones that are closest to it, all next to each other? Those are the memory module slots, right? What's everything else? I/O, right? There's a chipset, helps manage the bridge and data buses, right? The stuff underneath the printed circuit board, that's a lot of wires you can't see. There's a button cell there with and then there's a BIOS chipset, right? But most everything else is just I/O. I want you to think it's all I/O. So what are we saying? I bought this motherboard, high performance motherboard. After 3 or 4 years, I got tired of it. It was slow. So I popped out the CPU. I replaced the memory modules. For $200, I had a brand new fire-breathing Dragon. True story. Brand new. And that thing sat up and barked. It was very high performance, right? And now I did have to flash the BIOS because when the motherboard was purchased, the new type of CPU that was manufactured 2 years later didn't even exist then. So those are important aspects about the BIOS. The BIOS allows that motherboard to interact with all of the different components, and sometimes you have to update it. Very important idea. I want you to make sure that you watch this. I'm going to go ahead and turn up the link on that reference so that it's linked again. But you need to watch this, and there will be an assessment item on this video right here in the Module 4 assessment, or Module 5 assessment. Any questions? It talks about flashing the BIOS. So yeah, here's another reference. The BIOS is being replaced by the UEFI. So here I go into more details about what UEFI is, and here's the link. Everybody see that?
Yeah.
For some reason, the hyperlink wasn't showing on this. There, now it's showing. Okay, what's another basic operation that's consistent regardless of how fancy, how advanced computer architecture systems become? What's another common denominator? The CPU waltz. Once the CPU starts operating, it has a waltz, a 3-step dance. There's a famous waltz called the Blue Danube. Has anyone ever heard of this waltz before? La da 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 la da 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 da. That's called.
Yes, yes. Heard that song on TV.
Yes, it's a waltz. It's a 3-step. It's an old-fashioned dance, 3-step process. And I went through that horrible singing to sear into your brain this deep processing so that you would remember. Fetch, decode, execute. Step 1, step 2, step 3. The 3 steps that every CPU performs faithfully as it operates. It's going to fetch the data. It's going to decode the data most importantly, the instructions. So it fetches the data, then it decodes the instructions with the data, and then it executes some kind of instruction, right? Fetch, decode, execute. Fetch, decode, execute. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's a waltz. And they always do this, they do the same thing, right? Every computer architecture system built, the processor fetches the data, decodes the instructions, and then executes based on the instructions. That's the pattern. So understanding the fundamental patterns that are common for all digital systems is going to help us especially when we get to the bigger, more complex systems, because it's easy to get lost in the jungle. When you look at new systems, when you start talking about 64-bit buses and bridges, here is a diagram of a modern server motherboard. Okay? And you're going to say, well, where's the CPU and the memory? Right? It's kind of obscured. So the schematic diagram makes it a little harder to see. But one of the things that I want you to see is that all of these big dark lines are buses. They're 64 bits in width. So PCIe, that's actually 64-bit parallel lines. If you zoom in, that's what you see. Okay? And the square box here is supposed to represent the CPU. And what's always next to the CPU? The memory. This is called the North Bridge. So when you have a bunch of high-speed data buses, the high-speed data buses that run between the CPUs and the memory, the highest performance data buses, those are on the North Bridge. The South Bridge has to do with all of the input-output. So what am I saying? CPU and memory, North Bridge. All the other I/O, South Bridge. If I say hard disk, where's the hard disk? Is it up here or is it down here?
South Bridge.
It's where?
South Bridge.
It's the South Bridge, yeah. Yeah, it's I/O. A hard disk is an I/O device. It's an input-output combination device. So that means it's doing I/O. All the other I/O comes on the South Bridge. Now there is one special exception, a couple of special exceptions to that. You have these expansion card slots where you put graphics controllers. How many of you are gamers, gaming enthusiasts? NVIDIA?
Yeah, I mean,
yeah. So if you're a gaming enthusiast and you've heard about these NVIDIA graphics cards, NVIDIA graphics cards, Crossfire cards, everybody know what I'm talking about?
yeah.
Okay. The North Bridge and its data buses can be extended to special expansion slots. And that's where the graphics controllers plug in. There, on a server, you have RAID controllers, disk controllers for large data arrays, large disk arrays. So you can get very high performance peripherals or devices to connect to your system board or your gaming board, your high performance computer on the North Bridge, but it's usually a graphics controller or in special cases, a server in a data center. It's like a disk array. And we're going to talk about that more tomorrow, but that's where we're going to stop today. So I want you to remember that 99 times out of 100, CPU and memory are always on the North Bridge. I/O is always on the South Bridge. The two special exceptions are high performance data like RAID controller cards and network cards and graphics cards. So whenever you have something that's ultra high performance, you don't want it on the South Bridge. If you have ultra high performance network cards because you have gigabit wire speeds and you have massive disk arrays because you're running a data center, the data center control, the disk array controller, it's called a RAID controller, the graphics cards for supercomputing or gaming, and the network cards for like internet switching centers, all of those are high performance things. If it's high performance, it goes on the North Bridge. If it's regular I/O, it goes on the South Bridge. That's what I want you to remember. But 99 times out of 100, you don't have that really high-end, high-performance stuff. You just have a CPU and memory on the North Bridge. Are there any questions about the two data bus bridges? So that's where all the data buses come together and they have to kind of exchange information, and they call that a bridge. Everybody with me there? Any questions?
Yeah.
No question.
So if I tell you that I have an expansion card, a high performance custom expansion card, and I use it so that everybody gets gigabit internet at their house, where's that going to plug into? Southbridge or Northbridge?
Northbridge.
If I say we have graphics controllers, graphics cards, NVIDIA graphics cards, because we're doing super high resolution gaming scenarios on a network, high performance, where's that going? Northbridge or Southbridge?
North.
Bridge.
Northbridge, exactly. If I say I'm in a data center and I have a server and it connects 77 petabytes, that's like 77 billion, trillion, gajillion, bazillion bytes. It's a lot of bytes, right? It's like gigabytes of gigabytes, right? I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but it's a lot of data. It's enough for everybody to have their own 100 gigabytes of data, right? On the islands. Everybody has their own 100 gigabyte storage, right? That's, oh no, terabyte. Let's say terabyte. It's 100 terabytes, right? Everybody has 100 terabytes. Wow. That's a lot, right? 100,000 people having 100 terabytes? What are we talking about? Petabytes, right? All that data flying in and out on that one server. Where are you going to connect that card that runs all that data disk? Well, you don't want to be mobbed. You don't want people rioting. You don't want folks complaining because all their internet service is unusable and their data is unusable. So you're going to put it on the Northbridge. Just remember, high performance Northbridge, standard IO, things like keyboard, mouse, video, USB, disk drives, right? That's all Southbridge. Okay. Are there any questions about what we've covered so far? Remember that buses come together on a bridge. There's two main types, north and south. The buses have to do with all the connectors. And that chipset helps manage all the traffic back and forth. So those chipsets, the motherboard chipsets, help manage the bridges that coordinate the buses between all the devices. I want you to picture buses, many buses on a bridge. Okay? Any questions so far?
No.
Okay. Are we ready to take a break? I have another meeting I have to be in.
Yeah.
All right.
And
You're gonna link this on Blackboard, right?
yes, I'm going to put this on Blackboard along with the draft of the motherboard. Get started with reading right away. Get started with the reading as soon as possible. Okay? All right. So I'll go ahead and stop the recording.